Right, so it's day 74 of my New Year's tree planting resolution thing, and it still hasn't rained, but I have a plant that should be quite happy with that, so let's get on with it. Right, so today's tree is a little bit of a garbled one because there's a lot to say about it and I probably won't get it all in. So the first thing I want to tell you about is that it is used as a barrier plant. So this is Euphorbia tirucalli, the pencil tree, and it is very widely planted as a toxic hedge, which not only stops insects, but because as one of the milkweeds, the Euphorbiaceae, it has a bitter white sap to it, it very quickly convinces most livestock not to push through this hedge. So if you have goats, for example, and you also want to have vegetables, which is not usually a compatible issue, just see the riddle about the tiger, the goat, and the cabbage, planting a sort of kraal of this around your vegetables can mean that your goats don't get to it, or planting it around your goats means they are much more inclined to stay put than goats might otherwise be inclined to be. It's also used to sort of stop things like cattle, which are much heavier and could certainly push through it, moving into areas you don't want them, because it is an irritant and they very quickly learn not to push into and through this hedge to get to the juicy things on the other side that you don't want them to eat. It is also quite useful in terms of its soil chemistry. So planted by itself, such as in dense stands or in a hedge, it does tend to create a bare soil underneath it, which I really don't like, because when you have bare soil, the rain tends to compact that soil and then it runs off very easily, which is how you end up with very dry soils and a tendency to flooding, because that flat surface just is basically like concrete. The water just washes off and then pools on the lowest point, and the lowest point gets floods and everywhere else dries out too fast. But individually, it is a very distinct chemistry from things like guavas, from things like mangoes, from things like flamboyants, and so in areas where those are dominant trees, it's quite a good one to have growing in, because it will tolerate that acid soil very, very well, and it'll change the chemistry so it's not dominated by the chemicals that are released by any of those individual trees. If left to its own devices, again, though, it is not ideal, so it is best to have other trees close by, and it's often good to have some of the sort of high mass producing plants like bamboo, like the dracaenas, to sort of add a more neutral aspect to the soil and prevent any of this chemistry from getting sort of too out of control. The companion plants I'm putting in should be very tolerant of that chemistry, so we're getting with an aloe cameroni and some Cotyledon barbae, which are very tolerant of quite variable soils, so they shouldn't mind at all having the chemistry that this will eventually start dropping from its very small leaves into the soil. As with a lot of toxic plants, it has a long history of being used medically, and one of the things that is quite common in a lot of traditional medicines and is still present in a lot of modern medicine is the idea that this is toxic, but it's going to kill your disease faster than you if it's administered correctly. And it's very easy to go too far with trees like this, with trees like the erythrina, and with trees like the Syagrus, which are two that we might meet later on in the year if I find some that are ready for transplanting, because they're wonderful trees, but again, very toxic, very widely used for medicine, but very easy to over-medicate with. Another thing that I really like about it is we have a family of grasshoppers called blubber locusts here, which are generally quite specialized to the Euphorbiaceae and similar toxic plants, but they are long-lived insects, and like a lot of long-lived insects, if they can't find their primary host plant, they will sample other plants, and sometimes sample those to their detriment, because these are very large insects. They can move quite a long distance, and they tend to move in quite large numbers. They tend to be relatively social, at least in their early stages. And so if they don't find any milkweeds in an area they've moved into, they will try and eat other things, and they can sustain themselves quite well on things like citrus. So it's good to have something that is more suited to them, because if a group moves in, and they do periodically, I don't want, if we get a larger group than we've had before, that to end up causing damage to any of our current or future citrus trees. So I'd rather feed them this. One of the final things that I find quite interesting about this one is that it is probably originally from India, but it has been planted by humans for so long in parts of the Middle East and Africa that it is functionally native in a much wider range than it originally started. And it's sort of, you do see text refer to it as a native tree here. I wouldn't say that it really is native, but it is naturalized here and has been for such a long time that it sort of starts to blur the line of what is native and what is not. But yeah, so that should be everything for today. Thank you very much for tuning in and listening and or watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and please tune in again tomorrow. Right, so today's wildlife appendix might be a little less universally appealing, I recognise that, but this is Trichonephila fenestrata, who is one of, if not the actual largest web-building spider we have in Zambia. The largest web-building spider in the world is a quite close relative of this species from Madagascar and parts of South Africa and Mozambique, but she is one of millions, probably tens of millions, of this spider that are currently building webs all around Lusaka and eating just about every insect they can. There have been cases of larger animals getting caught in their webs, but their venom, I should note, is not medically significant to us. They're not the brightest little chickens in the book, because like most web-building spiders, they have a very limited response. So I don't actually want her in contact with my hand, because she could do some physical damage, but her venom won't do any sort of real medical damage to me, in all probability, if she does decide to have a nibble. But although there are probably millions around Lusaka right now, come the sort of mid-dry season, that will be down to thousands, and one of the reasons for that is they are very picky about the environments they can actually mature in. So at the moment, everything is humid, and they do very well in that humid environment, but as it dries out, they become very much a riverine spider, and any of the ones that have gone too far from that environment will not survive. An awful lot of them will also get eaten by birds. The bulbuls in particular like to steal the web to make their nests, and then come back for the spider to feed their young a few weeks later. But they can create this false impression of massive abundance and sort of tolerance of a really wide range of habitats, but actually, like a lot of invertebrates, most of the habitats you see them in are not ones they're going to be thriving in. They're ones they're coming into to feed and die. So yeah, don't take your spiders for granted.